This is the download recap from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Gavin Gaddis. The download is brought to you by Podscribe. You can find out more at podscribe.com. Now, let's get into this week's news. First up, a new video podcast experience is coming to Apple Podcasts. This Monday, Apple announced a, quote, transformative update, end quote, is coming to Apple Podcasts this spring. Currently out in developer beta, iOS 26.4 includes a new implementation of Apple's HTTP live streaming tech, also known as HLS. As James Cridland explains in his comprehensive breakdown, which you should read, the previous existing method for video podcasting on Apple Podcasts required creators to run a second feed for the video version of that same show. With the HLS update, podcasters hosting with supported hosting companies will have the ability to publish video versions of the same show that play alongside the audio natively within Apple Podcasts. In this new method, the podcast host provider connects to Apple Podcasts using a special API that reads an HLS playlist URL housing the episodes. The current list of podcast hosting companies partnered with Apple to accept video podcasts with this upcoming method are Acast, Art19, Omni Studio, and Simplecast. Apple will not charge hosting providers to distribute with this new HLS process, same as old school RSS, but later this year, they will begin charging participating ad networks an impression-based fee for dynamically inserted ads in HLS video on Apple Podcasts. Analyst Adam Bowie weighed in on the announcement, finding interest in how financial relationships will change as Apple's new HLS method gains traction, and as dynamically inserted ads become more commonplace in video podcasting overall. A landscape so nuanced, Bowie had to create a flowchart to demonstrate the differences in audio and video distribution. I recommend checking this one out. Zooming out to the bigger picture, anytime one of the big three distributors in podcasting, Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, make a big move like this, there's a temptation to frame it as a zero-sum game. Platforms will chase each other, after all. Tom Webster, in a new Sounds Profitable article, proposes it's more of a benefit for the entire field. Data from the Podcast Landscape 2025 shows nearly 80% of Apple Podcast users expect their podcast to be audio first, which makes sense. YouTube started as a video platform, Spotify started with music, and Apple Podcasts started with audio podcasts. The Landscape study also shows 42% of Apple video podcast consumers spend more than half of their time watching video instead of audio. That's a sizable baked-in audience of people who already wanted video. Apple bringing video more into Apple Podcasts isn't an instance of converting new audiences, it's connecting the plumbing to serve existing ones. All three major podcast platforms, with their respective different audience compositions, serve as on-ramps for people new to podcasting to get into podcasting in general. Instead of a zero-sum wrestling game between three companies, it's an overall wider funnel for the medium of podcasting itself, and widening it even further with this HLS outcome is a good thing. Let's talk partner highlights in this roundup. Semi-regularly, us at Sounds Profitable will venture out to conduct interviews and see what's up with folks around the business of podcasting. This week, I've got 4 good ones to spotlight. Catherine Brown, VP of Revenue and Partnerships at The Roost, shares her experience with a marketing campaign involving Theo Von, a silent polar bear, and zero sugar soda. To expand the footprint of their Super Bowl ad, Pepsi got in touch with The Roost to set up an ad campaign in which podcaster Theo Von interviews a polar bear that prefers Pepsi Zero Sugar to Coke Zero. Brown shares the experience of how that campaign came together and the mutual trust that was established between brand and creator that allowed them to create ads that feel like a normal Theo Von podcast clip. Gretchen Smith-Dubois, VP of Media at Ad Results Media, broached how busy 2026 has already been for the podcast world. For instance, YouTube's recent decision to reverse years of restrictive policy on certain topics, allowing videos discussing those topics to now be monetizable. She shares perspective as someone with experience on both sides of the brand safety and suitability fence about what this decision made with creator feedback and internal review, says about the larger use of brand safety with quote-unquote dangerous content. Thomas DiNapoli, VP, head of sales and underwriting at American Public Media and Minnesota Public Radio, sat down to talk about the business side of the world's eyes being on Minnesota. With the ongoing news developments in Minnesota in general and Minneapolis specifically, NPR journalists have been working hard. From the business side, DiNapoli speaks to the trust that public media has built with advertisers over the years with that journalism. Trust to the point that when NPR announced it was doing a nightly call-in show so journalists and community members could report on local developments, advertisers were signing up to fill slots less than 12 hours after seeing the initial brief. And Roger Nairn, co-founder and CEO of JAR Podcast Solutions, likes to process grief by talking it out, which dovetails into his new show, Dead Dads, in which he and co-host Scott Cunningham discuss their shared experience with having lost their fathers. As the show pitches, death, jokes, closure, not necessarily in that order. Roger Nairn shares his experience getting to be back in front of the mic after playing CEO for so long, as well as his goals for building a community of men who feel comfortable discussing grief. Next up, Triton Digital releases 2025 U.S. Podcast Report. This year's U.S. Podcast Report is built from IEB Tech Lab certified podcast metrics, data from leading hosting platforms, and Triton Digital's Demos Plus survey of 12,000 plus monthly podcast consumers. Reach continues to grow across demographics, with report finding listeners over-index into 18 to 34-year-olds, college graduates, high-income households, and diverse audiences. Audio-only consumption sits at just under 13% of respondents age 18 plus, and video is sitting at 7%. The diversity of podcasting's audience remains a highlight. The report argues the both size and diverse nature of said audience is, quote, creating a new high-value advertising opportunity for certain brand verticals, with data showing that new podcast listeners differ meaningfully from longtime listeners in their shopping behaviors and purchase intent, end quote. Specific examples of verticals that benefit from that include retail, quick service restaurants, wireless, and e-commerce. Format consumption preferences prove to vary by genre. For primary audio consumption, the genre's top 5 are science at 58%, history at 56%, fiction at 54%, arts at 51%, and true crime at 50%. Meanwhile, the top 5 genres for video-exclusive audiences are music at 34%, sports at 32%, kids and family at 31%, and comedy at 30%, and news also at 30%. The high ranking of music with video podcast consumers makes sense and reaffirms Tom Webster's open call a few months back to address audio podcasting's music licensing issues. Music thrives as a topic on YouTube. The video world has more leeway to produce content about music and can contain licensed songs, while audio podcasting hasn't had much of a chance to embrace it. And for our final top story, putting podcasts to work. This is by Laura Williams Tracy for the Charlotte Business Journal. It's commonplace for podcast advertising to sell itself on how podcasts are great at targeting niche audiences. This piece serves as anecdotal backup that it's still happening, and not just in the biggest cities. Williams Tracy writes about how Charlotte, North Carolina brands are embracing the advertising capabilities of podcasting by starting their own shows. Generally, stories about doctors finding patients thanks to promotional podcasts come from major metropolitan areas with populations in the millions. Charlotte, by comparison, has only grown past 900,000 residents in the past 6 years. Not a small town, but also not New York City, which speaks all the more to podcasting's ability to reach those niche audiences when a local plastic surgery outfit invests heavily in a podcast. According to the reporting, Graper Harper Cosmetic Surgery pivoted from hosting free seminars to try and court new patients to producing a podcast featuring 2 of their doctors. And in the B2B sphere, there's National Gypsum. Based in Charlotte, the National Construction Material Company has launched a podcast about construction. In essence, a show designed to target potential customers with something they can listen to while traveling to work sites. Finally, it's time for quick hits. These are articles I've covered throughout the week that I didn't just put in top stories, but are still worth including in your weekend reading. First up, this is a quick one. Podcast Movement has unveiled a nifty tool allowing you to upload a headshot or selfie and have it automatically placed into an announcement graphic saying you're attending Evolutions by Podcast Movement programming at South by Southwest. It's so easy, I can just say the URL. It's graphics.podcastmovement.com. Co-Host has rolled out a new integration with Salesforce, allowing users to sync podcast data into their CRM. Here's one. Mark your calendar for Wednesday, February 25th at 3:30 p.m. GMT for AudioStack's new Fast Track webinar. This one's titled Sound and Secure, Trust, Safety, and Ethics in the Age of AI Transformation. Audion has launched Audion AI, a tool designed to address the fragmented nature of podcast measurement. And Justin Jackson of the Podcast Standards Project has a new post explaining the current goals of the project, as well as how they plan to pursue those goals and affect change in the wider industry. That was the download recap brought to you by Sounds Profitable. I go through the stories fast, so a quick reminder, in your show notes is one link that'll take you to today's episode post on soundsprofitable.com, where you'll find links to everything I just talked about. You can also subscribe to the newsletter version of the download recap to get it straight to your inbox every Friday morning. For Sounds Profitable, I'm Gavin Gaddis. Our producers are myself, Brian Barletta, and Tom Webster. Special thanks, as always, to you for sticking with me as I brought you all the top stories you might have missed throughout the week. Robot.
Download complete.